Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. My guest today is Dr. Zachary Knight. Dr. Zachary Knight is a professor of physiology at the University of California, San Francisco, and an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. For those of you that don't know, Howard Hughes medical investigators are selected from an extremely competitive pool of applicants and have to renew in order to maintain their investigatorship with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute every 5 years or so, placing him in the most elite of categories with respect to research scientists. His laboratory focuses on homeostasis, in particular, what drives our sense of hunger, what drives our sense of thirst, and what controls thermoregulation, which is the ability to maintain body temperature within a specific safe range. Today, we mainly focus on hunger. Dr. Zachary Knight explains the biological mechanisms for craving food, for consuming food, and believe it or not, you have brain circuits that actually determine how much you're likely to eat even before you take your very first bite. And he explains the biological mechanisms for satiety, that is, the sense that one has had enough of a particular food or food group. Dr. Knight also explains the role of dopamine in food craving and consumption, which I think everybody will find very surprising because it runs countercurrent to most people's understanding of what dopamine does in the context of eating and other cravings. Today's discussion also includes a deep dive into GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide, and the novel class of drugs such as Ozempic and Mounjaro and other related compounds that are now widespread in use for the reduction in body weight. Dr. Knight explains how GLP-1 was first discovered and how these drugs were developed, how they work, and importantly, why they work, and how that is leading to the next generation of so-called diet drugs or drugs to treat obesity, diabetes, and related syndromes. We also discussed thirst and the intimate relationship between water consumption and food consumption. And we also talk about the relationship between sodium intake, water intake, and food intake. By the end of today's conversation, you will have learned a tremendous amount about the modern understanding of hunger, thirst, and salt intake, as well as this modern class of drugs such as Ozempic and related compounds, all from a truly world-class investigator in the subjects of researching hunger, thirst, and thermal regulation. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is BetterHelp. BetterHelp offers professional therapy with a licensed therapist carried out entirely online. Now, I've been doing weekly therapy for well over 30 years. Initially, I didn't have a choice. It was a condition of being allowed to stay in high school. But quickly I realized that therapy is an extremely important component to our overall health. In fact, I consider doing regular therapy as important as getting regular cardiovascular exercise and resistance training, which of course I also do every week. Now, there are essentially three things that great therapy provides. First of all, it requires that you have a really good rapport with the therapist, somebody that you can trust and talk to about what's really going on in your life. And of course, an excellent therapist will provide you support in moving towards the things that are going to grow your life in the best ways. And third, and this is the one that people often overlook, an expert therapist is somebody who can really provide you useful insights that would not otherwise be obvious to you. With BetterHelp, they make it very easy to find the therapist with whom you can have those three essential and highly effective components. If you'd like to try BetterHelp, you can go to betterhelp.com/Huberman to get 10% off your first month. Again, that's betterhelp.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by 8 Sleep. 8 Sleep makes smart mattress covers with cooling, heating, and sleep tracking capacity. Now, I've spoken many times before on this podcast about the critical need for us to get adequate amounts of quality sleep each night. One of the best ways to ensure a great night's sleep is to control the temperature of your sleeping environment. And that's because in order to fall and stay deeply asleep, your body temperature actually has to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees. And in order to wake up feeling refreshed and energized, your body temperature actually has to increase by about 1 to 3 degrees. 8 Sleep makes it incredibly easy to control the temperature of your sleeping environment by allowing you to program the temperature of your mattress cover at the beginning, middle, and end of the night. I've been sleeping on an 8 Sleep mattress cover for well over 3 years now, and it has completely transformed my sleep for the better. 8 Sleep recently launched their newest generation pod cover, the Pod 4 Ultra. The Pod 4 Ultra has improved cooling and heating capacity, higher fidelity sleep tracking technology, and it also has snoring detection that remarkably will automatically lift your head a few degrees to improve your airflow and stop your snoring. If you'd like to try an 8 Sleep mattress cover, you can go to 8sleep.com/Huberman to save $350 off their Pod 4 Ultra. 8 Sleep currently ships to the USA, Canada, UK, select countries in the EU, and Australia. Again, that's 8sleep.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Waking Up. Waking Up is a meditation app that offers hundreds of guided meditation programs, mindfulness trainings, yoga nidra sessions, and more. I started practicing meditation when I was about 15 years old, and it made a profound impact on my life. And by now, there are thousands of quality peer-reviewed studies that emphasize how useful mindfulness meditation can be for improving our focus, managing stress and anxiety, improving our mood, and much more. In recent years, I started using the Waking Up app for my meditations because I find it to be a terrific resource for allowing me to really be consistent with my meditation practice. Many people start a meditation practice and experience some benefits, but many people also have challenges keeping up with that practice. What I and so many other people love about the Waking Up app is that it has a lot of different meditations to choose from, and those meditations are of different durations. So it makes it very easy to keep up with your meditation practice, both from the perspective of novelty. You never get tired of those meditations. There's always something new to explore and to learn about yourself and about the effectiveness of meditation. And you can always fit meditation into your schedule, even if you only have 2 or 3 minutes per day in which to meditate. I also really like doing yoga nidra, or what is sometimes called non-sleep deep rest, for about 10 or 20 minutes, because it is a great way to restore mental and physical vigor without the tiredness that some people experience when they wake up from a conventional nap. If you'd like to try the Waking Up app, please go to wakingup.com/Huberman, where you can access a free 30-day trial. Again, that's wakingup.com/Huberman to access a free 30-day trial. And now for my discussion with Dr. Zachary Knight. Dr. Zachary Knight, welcome.
Great to be here.
Today we're going to talk about hunger, appetite, thirst, other motivated behaviors, the role of dopamine, the vagus nerve. These are terms and topics that a lot of people hear nowadays and for which there's a ton of interest. But just to march us in sequentially, could you describe some of what's happening in the brain and or body as we get hungry, decide what to eat, and then decide that we've had enough to eat? I think most people just assume that, okay, that my stomach's full is what we say.
Right.
I've had enough. Or we self-regulate it for some other reason, caloric restriction or monitoring in some cases. What's happening in the brain in terms of the circuitries? And what have you discovered about what that process looks like in terms of its kind of universality across people, and then maybe how it sometimes differs between people?
Okay. Well, there's a lot in that I'll try to unpack.
Yeah. And I can remind of some of the nuance there. But just, in other words, as a biologist, as a neuroscientist, how do you think about this thing that we call hunger and feeding?
Absolutely. So I think at a very high level, a good way to think about the regulation of food intake by the brain is that there's 2 systems, a short-term system and a long-term system, that are primarily localized to different parts of the brain, operate on different timescales, one on the timescale of a meal, so 10, 20 minutes, and the other on the timescale of sort of weeks to months to years, and tracks levels of body fat. And these 2 systems sort of interact so that these short-term behaviors we do, eating, are matched to our long-term need for energy. And so I think one of the initial experiments that really led to this idea is this great experiment by Harvey Grill about 50 years ago. It's called the decerebrate rat. And so essentially what he did was he made a cut in the rat brain. So he took these rats in the lab, made a cut so that he separated the brainstem, so the most posterior part of the brain, from the entire forebrain. Basically got rid of 80% of the rat's brain. So this basically creating these zombie rats. Right? All they have is a brainstem, and asked, what can these rats still do? And as you might imagine, they can't do a lot of things, right? Because they basically have lost most of their brain. But he discovered that one thing they can still do is regulate the size of a meal. And so,
very informative experiment.
And you have to be careful how we talk about this, because the way this meal works is you have to actually put food into their mouth, and then they'll swallow it as you put food into their mouth. But eventually, at some point, they'll start spitting it out. And that basically is an indication that in some sense they're becoming sated, and they're just using the brainstem that they have left, are able to sense those signals from the gut and drive the termination of a meal. And he did other experiments showing that many of these signals that come from the gut, gastric stretch, hormones that come from your intestine in response to food intake like CCK, these decerebrate rats that just have a brainstem, if you inject those or manipulate the gut in those ways, it can in an appropriate way change how much the rat eats. Now, what can't the rat do when it doesn't have a forebrain? And the thing it can't do is it can't respond to longer-term changes in energy need. Meaning, if you fast the rat for a couple days, this decerebrate rat, then start putting food in its mouth, the amount that it eats doesn't change. So basically, it doesn't eat a larger meal the way you would if you were fasted for several days and then refed. And that experiment, along with other evidence, has led to the idea that in the brainstem, and in the most posterior part of your brain, there are neural circuits that control sort of a meal, and then the time scale of 10 minutes or 20 minutes, deciding when a meal should end. And in the forebrain, primarily in the hypothalamus, there are neural circuits that then track what is my overall level of energy reserves, what is my level of body fat, things that would fluctuate on a time scale of, say, days when you're fasting. And those forebrain centers feed back to talk to the brainstem and modulate those brainstem circuits that are controlling the size of a meal to sort of match these two time scales. So that's at the highest level how I think about the neural circuitry that controls feeding. There's obviously a lot more going on underneath that. But.
Fascinating. You mentioned body fat and that somehow the brain is tracking the amount of body fat. That caught my ear because while it makes total sense, I'd like to know how that happens if we happen to know the mechanism. And the second question is, why body fat and not body fat and muscular mass or body fat and overall body weight? What is being signaled between body fat and the brain that allows the brain to track body fat? And why do you think body fat is the critical signal? I realize it represents an energy reserve, but certainly there are other things about the bodily state that are important.
Yeah, well, there are certainly other things about the bodily state that are important, and there are other things about physiology definitely that are regulated other than body fat. But body fat is unique because it represents this energy reserve. So the neural circuitry that regulates eating behavior is in some ways very unique because it has this reserve of energy. So we also study thirst in my lab and drinking, and you don't have a reserve of water in your body, right? And that's true for basically everything else. But for fat, we have this reserve of energy, and so it's very important that the brain know how much remains, and then adjust behavior in accordance with that, so that you know how urgent it is to get the next meal. And so the thought is that the major signal of the level of body fat that we have is leptin. It's this hormone. It was discovered. It was cloned in 1994, actually by my postdoctoral advisor, a scientist named Jeff Friedman at Rockefeller University. Although its history goes back way before 1994. So the sort of story behind leptin is that there's a facility called Jackson Labs that I'm sure, familiar with in Maine that since the 1920s has been raising mice and selling them to academics, basically, who study physiology and behavior. And so they breed thousands of mice. They're sort of a nonprofit organization that distributes mice to the scientific community. And at some point in the 1950s, they spontaneously, just because they were breeding so many mice, they came across some spontaneous mutations, mutant mice that were extremely fat, like the fattest mice they had ever seen. These mice just eat constantly. They're just enormous, 3 times the size of a normal mouse. And it's all body fat. So they're just these huge fat mice. And they came across several different mutant strains that all had the same phenotype in the sense that they were all extremely fat, all extremely hyperphagic. But they could tell, even in the 1950s, that these mutations were on different chromosomes. They didn't know anything about how to identify the genes at that point. That was just science fiction. But they knew that there were chromosomes, and they were on different chromosomes. And so they labeled one obese, one of these mouse strains obese, and the other one diabetes. But they were basically the same. And so people wondered for a long time, well, what's going on in these mice? Then there was a scientist at Jackson Labs, Doug Coleman, who had the idea, what if we do an experiment where we connect the circulations of these 2 different strains of obese mice and test the hypothesis that maybe there's a circulating factor, a hormone, that is produced by one of these strains and that controls appetite. Because at that point, insulin was known, glucagon was known. There were some hormones that were known that were involved in metabolism, so it was logical that there could be a hormone that perhaps regulates body fat levels. And what they found, which was remarkable when you attach the OB strain to the DB strain. So you basically connect their circulation, so hormones are transmitted between the two. The OB mouse, that strain dramatically loses weight. In fact, within a couple weeks, it looks like a normal mouse. It just stops eating, it loses almost all of its body fat, and it essentially in all respects becomes a normal mouse. The DB mouse, nothing really happens. It still remains obese and still remains hyperphagic. And based on just that piece of data, Doug Coleman hypothesized that what was going on is these two mutations were mutations in a hormone and a receptor. The OB mouse had a mutation in the hormone that comes from fat, so it couldn't produce this hormone that comes from fat and signals to the brain how much fat you have. And the DB mouse has a mutation in the receptor, so it can't sense the hormone. And that was just an idea, it was a hypothesis. But in the 1980s, as technology advanced, as it became, there's molecular biology had been invented, it became possible to clone genes. A number of people tried to identify what are the genetic mutations that are occurring in these mice that make them so obese. And Jeff basically cloned leptin and showed that, in fact, Doug was exactly right. The OB mutation is a mutation in this hormone, leptin. And later, Millennium Pharmaceuticals showed that the DB mutation is, in fact, a receptor. And it was an important discovery for a couple of reasons. One, because this OB gene is just expressed in fat. It's exclusively expressed in adipose tissue. And how much it's expressed is directly proportional to how much body fat you have. So as you gain weight, the expression of this hormone increases in a linear manner, and then it's secreted into the blood. So the level of leptin in your blood is a direct readout of your body fat reserves. This receptor for leptin, the leptin receptor, the functional form of it is expressed almost exclusively in the brain. And it's expressed in all of the brain regions that we knew from previous work were important for appetite. So basically the expression of this receptor gives you a map in the brain of the neurons that control hunger. And so what happens is basically when you lose weight, the levels of leptin in your blood fall because basically you've lost adipose tissue. The absence of that hormone sends a signal to all these neurons that have leptin receptors in the brain. They're not getting that signal that I'm starving. And it basically that initiates this entire homeostatic response to starvation. So a big part of that is obviously increased hunger, but it's also decreased energy expenditure, decreased body temperature, even decreased fertility because you don't want to reproduce if you're starving.
Less spontaneous movement.
All of this. Mm-hmm. And so the thought is, which I think is absolutely correct, is that this hormone leptin is part of this negative feedback loop from the fat to the brain that basically tells you about your level of body fat reserves and how urgent it is to find the next meal.
Fascinating. As I recall, Amgen Pharmaceuticals owned the patent for leptin in hopes that it would become the blockbuster diet drug, the logic being that if you were to take this hormone somehow or activate this pathway, that the brain would be tricked into thinking that there was more body fat, more energy reserves than there was, and then people would basically be less hungry, eat less, and lose body fat.
Yes.
What happened with that? Or do we know why it did not work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there was a lot of excitement when leptin was cloned because it was thought basically we've cured obesity. There was an auction for the patent. Amgen won, I think it was something like $20 million upfront payment plus royalties, which at the time was, it still is a lot of money, but even more money.
Nowadays, it would be a drop in the ocean compared to what companies will invest into potential diet drugs.
Exactly. So, but at the time, and still a lot of money today. And they did a clinical trial, gave obese people leptin, subcutaneous injections of this hormone, and they didn't lose a lot of weight. And the question was why. And so what was subsequently revealed is that the challenge with leptin is that individuals who are obese do not have low levels of leptin for the most part. They actually have high levels of leptin. And so what they have is a state of leptin resistance. So it's analogous to someone who has type 2 diabetes. It's not because they lack insulin. It's because they actually have, over time, a high level of insulin. And so target tissues stop responding to insulin. And the thought is that it's the same way in obesity and leptin. Now, subsequently, they went back and did a reanalysis of that clinical trial and asked, what if you take all of these people and stratify them according to their starting leptin level? So some people have relatively low levels of leptin, some have higher, some have really high levels of leptin. And then ask, if we reanalyze the data, how effective is leptin? And as you might expect, the people with the lowest levels of leptin, they lost the most weight when you gave them this drug. And the people with the highest levels of leptin lost the least weight. So there is a rationale there why, for a scenario in which leptin could work, either among the subset of people who just have, for some reason, lower levels of leptin. These aren't people with mutations like the OB mouse. They have some leptin. They just don't have unusually high levels. Or, alternatively, after weight loss. So after you've lost a lot of weight, your leptin levels plummet. They become very low. And that part of the reason, it's a big part of the reason it's so difficult to keep weight off is because those leptin levels are so low. And so it's been thought for a long time that is a scenario where treating people with leptin could be really useful to help them keep the weight off. Why it never made it as a drug for that application, I really don't understand. It has something to do, I think, with the pharmaceutical industry, with the economics, with a bunch of other issues that aren't necessarily scientific. But I think there's still, in the future, is a possibility that it could come back for that indication, especially now that we have these GLP-1 drugs, and now there's just millions of people losing so much weight, and perhaps they want to transition to a different kind of drug to keep the weight off.
Well, we are definitely going to talk about GLP-1, Ozempic, and some of the related compounds in a few minutes. But before we do that, I'd love to get to this issue of what's happening in the brain as we get hungry, approach a meal, decide what to eat, and decide when we've had enough. Are there separate circuitries or at least separate neurons for each of those steps? And if you would, could you walk us through what that process looks like, since we do it every day? Most people do it every day unless they're fasting, multiple times per day. What's going on in our brain and body as we think about and approach a meal, consume a meal, and decide enough?
Sure. So there are different neurons that are preferentially involved in different aspects of those processes. So I think we often divide feeding behavior and many other kinds of motivated behaviors into appetitive and consummatory phases. So appetitive is the phase of the behavior where you're, for example, searching for food. It's foraging. It's all the actions that lead up to the actual behavior itself, which then we call the consummatory phase. That's actually putting the food in your mouth and eating it. And the general thought is that these forebrain circuits in the hypothalamus are more important, particularly in the hypothalamus, but other parts of the forebrain as well, are more important for the appetitive phase. And the brainstem circuits are more important for the consummatory phase, the actual putting it in your mouth and licking, chewing, swallowing, and all of that. Within the hypothalamus, there's a population of neurons called AGRP neurons. So it's just an acronym, AGRP, and it stands for agouti-related peptide, but it doesn't really matter. They're absolutely critical for that appetitive phase, for the searching for food, for the desire to find food and consume it when you're hungry.
Just to touch on the AGRP neurons and this appetitive phase, are they known to connect to areas of the brain and body that stimulate the desire to move? Because I think about when I get hungry, if I'm at my desk or something, I need to get up and find food. I need to walk to lunch or go to the refrigerator. Are they somehow linked to the circuits that promote locomotion?
Well, they have to promote those things, but they're not directly linked to any of those circuits. They're linked directly to other forebrain circuits involved in motivation. So the way we think about, what these kinds of neurons like AGRP neurons are doing, they're not directly talking to the motor circuits to tell you to move your legs or arms to pick up the sandwich or whatever. They're rather creating this general problem that the animal has to solve, which is that I'm hungry, I need to get food. It would be really great if I could have a sandwich. And then the animal uses all of its mental capacities, right, to solve that problem. So they're just there to set the goal, not so much to direct the solution. Mm-hmm. And so, but these AGRP neurons, there are a few thousand neurons at the base of the hypothalamus. So basically the most ventral, the most bottom part of the forebrain. So tiny population of cells, but outsized importance for the control of feeding behavior. So if you stimulate these cells in a mouse or a rat that's not hungry, the animal will voraciously eat like it's starving. If you silence these cells, animals will starve to death. So you can basically give them food. They just won't eat it voluntarily until basically you have to euthanize them because they've lost so much weight. And the activity of these AGRP neurons is thought to track the body's need for energy. One reason that's thought is that they express these receptors for leptin, this hormone that I was just talking about that comes from fat and signals the level of body fat reserves. And leptin inhibits AGRP neurons. So as you might expect, if you have lots of body fat, then a neuron that controls hunger should be less active than if you have very little body fat. So that's one mechanism by which leptin controls hunger. We in my lab have investigated the role of these AGRP neurons from a slightly different perspective, which is, and this relates to your question about what happens when we approach food, when we start a meal, and to ask, what are their activity patterns? What is the natural sort of firing of this population of neurons when an animal eats a meal? Which is a very basic question, something I think we've wanted to know for a long time. Was not really addressable until about 10 years ago because just the technology didn't exist, because these are such a tiny population of cells so deep in the brain. So one of the very first experiments we did in my lab was to investigate that, to ask for the first time what happens to these AGRP neurons when an animal eats. And so one of my first graduate students, Yiming Chen, he used a technology called fiber photometry, which allows us to put a fiber optic into the mouse's brain so that then we could record fluorescence from these AGRP neurons, which we could use as a readout of their activity. It's basically using a calcium sensor, so calcium is a surrogate for neural activity. And one of the very first experiments he did, we said, let's make the animal hungry. Yeah, these AGRP neurons will be very active because the animal's hungry, and then let's give it some food and see what happens during a meal. And our expectation was that these AGRP neurons would gradually decline in activity as the animal eats and levels of hormones in the blood start changing, feeding back to inhibit these neurons. But what we found was really surprising. I remember that when he made this discovery, basically him running into my office and saying, Zach, I gave the mouse the piece of food, but the weirdest thing happened. The neurons shut off almost immediately. And I said, you've made a mistake. It's okay. You're just starting off in graduate school. This happens. Go back and repeat the experiment, and then we'll discuss it. But he did several times. He said, Zach, every single time this happens, I give a hungry mouse food, and the AGRP neurons, within just a few seconds, their activity has greatly diminished, back to the level it would be in a fed mouse, even before they take the first bite of food. And so Yiming then went to do a series of experiments to try to understand what was going on. And what he basically showed by changing the kind of food he gave them, or the accessibility of the food, or how hungry the mouse was, and measuring the response of these AGRP neurons, was that what the neurons were doing was predicting. The mouse looks at the food, it looks at how palatable it is, imagines how hungry the mouse is, how accessible it is, and then within a few seconds, these neurons predict how much food the mouse is going to eat in the forthcoming meal. And so essentially, these neurons know how much the mouse is going to eat before the mouse even takes the first bite. And you can show this by a very simple analysis in which you give the mouse different foods and you look at how much these AGRP neurons drop when the mouse sees and smells the food. And then you plot that against this drop happens in 3 seconds, 4 seconds, something like that. Then you look at how much does the mouse go on to eat in the next 30 minutes. You can just draw a straight line. So this was one of the first results from my lab, and it was really surprising to all of us, and I think everyone. But it illustrated a theme that we've now seen again and again, which is that these circuits that control internal state, control things like hunger and thirst, what they're constantly doing is predicting the future. They can sense these signals from the body that tell you about what's happened, but those signals are slow. And you don't want to wait 20 minutes from the food that you ingested to reach your stomach and then slowly start entering your intestine to figure out what was the nutrient content of the meal. You want to try to figure that out as soon as you can, right? And so the animals learn, presumably through just experience, that, okay, something that smells like this and looks like this, it has about this many calories, and I know I'm this hungry, so I'm going to eat about this much. And then that information is all transmitted to these circuits to start the process of satiation before the meal begins.
Is it satiation, or it's ceasing of foraging, so that the animal, or if I translate to a person, decides, okay, now I'm going to consume this sandwich, this package of food?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't fully know the answer. So one interpretation of the data I just showed you is exactly what you said, is that what these neurons do is they control foraging alone. They don't control eating. And so this is perfect. You see the food, you know it's got enough calories, the neurons shut off, and then you stay there and eat it. You transition from this appetitive to this consummatory phase. But that doesn't seem to be the whole explanation, because if you artificially stimulate these neurons, so prevent that drop from ever happening, just stimulate them continually, the mouse will just sit there and eat. So you can't fully separate, although we like to make this distinction between appetitive and consummatory, and we know that in different parts of the brain, there's more important for one versus the other. The reality is that the entire behavior is linked, and you can't fully separate them. So there's a number of ideas about what this means. So one idea that I just mentioned is that starting the process of satiety before the meal begins. Another idea, which you mentioned, which could be part of the answer, is that it is reducing this appetitive drive and allowing the transition to consummatory behavior. Another idea is that, and I call these ideas because we don't really fully know the answer yet for exactly what the purpose is. And in biology, it's always hard to answer why something happens. You can figure out what happens, but then the reason why it evolved that way is challenging. Another idea is it's involved in these what we call cephalic phase responses. that are necessary to prepare you for a meal. Right, so the famous example of this is Pavlov, right? Basically, trains the dog to associate the ringing of the bell with the presentation of food, and then eventually the ringing of the bell alone causes the dog to salivate in the absence of any food. And salivation is one example of a cephalic phase response. The purpose of that is to have enzymes in your mouth that basically are going to digest the food and get them there right before you need them. But there's all sorts of other things, like basically the secretion of insulin occurs in response to food cues, changes in gastric acid, gut motility. All these things are getting ready for the meal to happen. And so another idea is it could be part of that, but it probably is doing all of these things.
As many of you know, I've been taking AG1 for more than 10 years now, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring this podcast. To be clear, I don't take AG1 because they're a sponsor. Rather, they are a sponsor because I take AG1. In fact, I take AG1 once and often twice every single day, and I've done that since starting way back in 2012. There is so much conflicting information out there nowadays about what proper nutrition is. But here's what there seems to be a general consensus on. Whether you're an omnivore, a carnivore, a vegetarian, or a vegan, I think it's generally agreed that you should get most of your food from unprocessed or minimally processed sources, which allows you to eat enough but not overeat, get plenty of vitamins and minerals, probiotics, and micronutrients that we all need for physical and mental health. Now, I personally am an omnivore, and I strive to get most of my food from unprocessed or minimally processed sources. But the reason I still take AG1 once and often twice every day is that it ensures I get all of those vitamins, minerals, probiotics, etc. But it also has adaptogens to help me cope with stress. It's basically a nutritional insurance policy meant to augment, not replace, quality food. So by drinking a serving of AG1 in the morning and again in the afternoon or evening, I cover all of my foundational nutritional needs. And I, like so many other people that take AG1, report feeling much better in a number of important ways, such as energy levels, digestion, sleep, and more. So while many supplements out there are really directed towards obtaining one specific outcome, AG1 is foundational nutrition designed to support all aspects of well-being related to mental health and physical health. If you'd like to try AG1, you can go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim a special offer. They'll give you 5 free travel packs with your order, plus a year's supply of vitamin D3 K2. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Huberman. It's so interesting. I have a number of questions, but I think the one that I'll put at the top of the list is the other night we were out to dinner in New York, and I was very hungry. I hadn't eaten much that day, and I was looking forward to a nice steak. They brought out bread, French bread. It was a French restaurant. I took one bite. I realized it was absolutely delicious French bread. The butter was fantastic, and so I had some bread and butter, which I love.
Yes.
Then they brought more, and then they started bringing out, I don't know who ordered them because I didn't, appetizers. And I realized that this was going to be a much more extensive, calorically dense meal. And suddenly my appetite for the appetizers, it sort of went down because I knew there was more food coming, right?
Yes.
Had I not known that there was more food coming, I think
Yes.
I would have consumed more of the appetizers, which also looked great. So clearly there's something going on with these AGRP neurons in
Right.
that moment. You're sort of integrating based on new information.
Exactly.
On the other end of the spectrum, I did a solo episode about eating disorders and anorexia nervosa in particular. And one of the things that I learned from experts in that field, the psychiatrists who work on this and the scientists who work on this, is that people with anorexia are unbelievably tuned to the caloric content of food.
Huh.
That their visual system and presumably other systems have become like almost hyper-accurate calculators of the amount of calories in food. They've devoted a lot of cognition to it. It sometimes can border on or be placed within the obsessive realm, but that they see food and they can tell you a tremendous amount about the caloric amounts with these foods, even food combinations to, in a very small margin of error.
Okay.
So, and that drives in that condition, obviously, food avoidance.
Yeah.
So I have to assume that these AGRP neurons are involved in this kind of thing. One represents a regulation in the case of the example I gave, and in the other case, let's just call it what it is, because anorexia nervosa is the most deadly of the psychiatric conditions, sadly,
Yes.
a pathologic dysregulation, a maladaptive dysregulation. So what is known about these AGRP neurons in humans? Meaning, do they exist in humans? Presumably they express the leptin receptor. sounds like they are able to integrate information, both cognitive, based on immediate experience, visual, olfactory, but also a lot of prior experience. A hamburger patty, can't tell you how many calories it has. All I know is that it's mostly protein and some fat. What are these neurons doing? What do they have access to? They sound like, anytime I hear about hypothalamus, I think very basic drives, but you're talking about a pretty sophisticated analysis of a real-time event that is driving fairly nuanced behavioral decisions and updating that, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
We're both neuroscientists, but for everyone listening and watching, this is a big deal. This is as nuanced as deciding whether or not somebody is friend or foe, or deciding whether or not you like a movie or you don't. I mean, this is some pretty sophisticated processing. This isn't eat, don't eat, or eat less, eat more. These aren't switches.
Exactly.
These are dials.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot there. I'll try to unpack that. So the first thing I would say is they are present in humans, and humans have HGRP neurons. Human HGRP neurons express the leptin receptor, and we think the functions are very similar. So one of the nice things actually about studying these kinds of things, like basic mechanisms of hunger, thirst, because these things are so important for survival, they've been under really strong selection, right? And so many of the components of these systems are genetically hardwired, meaning these are cell types that have a single purpose, in this case to control hunger. They're labeled by specific genes, and those are conserved through evolution. We also know that this pathway, this HGRP neuron pathway, is important in humans due to human genetics. So just to add a little bit more information here, there's a companion set of neurons called POMC neurons that promote satiety. So they're sort of the yin and yang of hunger. HGRP neurons promote hunger, POMC neurons promote satiety. They're intermingled in the same part of the hypothalamus. They're axons that project to the exact same downstream brain regions. Then it's thought that these two neurons compete with each other to control appetite. And that competition occurs through neuropeptides that they release, one of which is an agonist for a downstream receptor, and the other one of which is an antagonist. We know from human genetics that that among severely obese people, mutations in this pathway, HGRP, POMC neurons, and their direct downstream targets, are quite common.
Really? So is it fair to say that some amount of obesity is genetic in nature at the level of neuronal firing or circuitry?
I think a lot of body weight regulation is genetic. It's highly heritable. There's a question of how much of it is due to single genes. And the number people quote, and this is among people who are severely obese, so not just people who you've seen someone who's overweight, but people who have sort of syndromes where they're very obese from a very young age. Among those people, something on the order of 10% have mutations in this pathway. And it can either be this hormone POMC, or an enzyme within those cells that processes POMC into the right form, or and this is the most common mutation, in the downstream receptor for POMC. It's called the melanocortin 4 receptor. And so among the severely obese, people who have sort of genetically inherited severe obesity from childhood, something on the order of 10% have mutations in this pathway. So it's very clear that this pathway is involved in body weight regulation in humans. Most obesity, although there's a very strong genetic component, is not associated with single gene mutations like this. It's associated with effects of many mutations. But we know that even in that sort of polygenic obesity that has many different genetic causes, that the brain is important. And one of the reasons we know that is if you look at the genes through genetic association studies that have been associated with body weight, and there's been lots of genetic association studies trying to find mutations that are associated with whether you're lean or obese. Something on the order of 1,000 genes have been linked to body weight regulation. And the vast majority of those are expressed in the brain. They're highly enriched for brain processes, which makes sense because body weight is controlled by food intake, right? And the brain controls behavior, and also the brain controls energy expenditure. So maybe it's not so surprising, but it's clear that that mutations in genes in the brain are important for body weight, and which is consistent with the results of twin studies. So if you look at monozygotic versus dizygotic twins, the estimates for the heritability of body weight is something on the order of 80%.
We should explain monozygotic, dizygotic, which I've talked about before on the podcast, just to brush people up.
Just identical versus fraternal twins, basically. Mm-hmm. And so, and by comparing their body weight when they become adults. You can get a sense for how much of this is genetic versus environmental. And something on the order of 80% is thought to, of the variation between individuals is thought to have a genetic component.
Wow.
So
I don't think most people appreciate that.
Yeah.
And a lot of the debate we hear nowadays is because there are things that people can do to lose body fat, exercise, eat differently, et cetera, maybe embrace pharmacology if that's appropriate. There seems to be this, to me, silly debate as to whether or not people should be eating better and exercising, or assuming that all of the obesity they might have arises through genetic causes, and therefore take a prescription drug. I mean, why wouldn't it be a combination of things?
Yeah.
Like, to me, it just seems like, why wouldn't people embrace some or all of the tools that they could afford and that are safe for them? So I just want to get that out there, because the moment this comes up, people start thinking, oh, well, the moment we assign a genetic source to something, we're removing personal responsibility. But of course, there are people, I know people who have struggled with their weight their entire lives, for whom some of these new pharmaceuticals like Ozempic have provided them the opportunity to finally be able to lose weight and feel better and exercise safely.
Yeah.
For instance.
I completely agree with that. I think there is a misconception out there about this, about what it means for something to be genetically heritable. And I think this gets to the root of why so many people find this sort of hard to believe, that there's such a strong genetic component to body weight. And that's the idea that, you know, if you look at people, say, 75 years ago, right, they were much leaner. Right. And you look at people today, and there's been this, starting sometime around, the 1970s, there's this explosion in body weight and increase in obesity.
Is that when, when it started, mid-70s?
Sort of the 1970s is when a lot of that started.
Food, snacking.
So there's lots of, there's lots of explanations.
Seed oil, snack. By the way, I don't think that's the reason, folks. I think there are a lot of reasons. But the theories that abound right now on social media are, I have a list of the theories as to why the obesity has increased. You get everything from seed oils to snacking to smartphones to conspiracies to, it's wild.
Yeah.
It's wild. The range of hypotheses is wild.
Yeah. I mean, the challenge is, some of them could be true, but it's just very hard to test those things experimentally because they're happening in the whole population, right? Yeah. But so I think the thing that people find hard to wrap their heads around, because it is a little bit of a confusing idea, is that how can it be that in, say, 50 or 75 years, there's been this explosion in obesity, which is, the environment has changed, but human genetics has not changed in that amount of time. It's just not fast enough for people to evolve. So it can't be due to mutations in humans.
What about devolve? My understanding is that within a species, evolving new traits is very slow.
Yes.
But mutations arise, like the OB mutation, and then you can get very fat versions of an animal very quickly, right? All you need is if it's a recessive allele, you need 2 copies, and the next thing you know, you've got a mouse that's 4 times larger than a typical mouse, and it's all explained by increased body weight. So that can happen very quickly within a species. What's rare to find is an entire new branch of a species that has a very new adaptive function. That seems more rare.
Well, so that's true. So definitely, there's some things that take longer to evolve than others. But with humans, we're talking about just 2 generations. There just isn't enough time for any evolution of any significance to happen.
We went baby boomers, right?
Generation X.
That's me, right? And then whatever is Y, Z, millennial.
Exactly.
Like I lose track after
exactly.
that.
So I think the thing that people find hard to wrap their heads around is, how can it be that that increase in body weight is clearly environmental, right? Because that's all that's changed is the environment. Nothing has changed genetically. Yet it's also true what I said, that body weight is extremely heritable. It's one of the most heritable features. And something on the order of 80%. One of the only things we know about that's actually more heritable than body weight is height, right? Most diseases are not as heritable as body weight. How can you explain that? And the idea is this: there's a distribution of body weights among people. So in any given society, at any point in time, some people are going to be leaner, some people are going to be more obese. That distribution, where you lie on that distribution, is determined primarily by genetics. So you may be the person who has the thrifty genes, so that basically cause you to save energy, and so you would be more on the obese side. Or you may be a person who has different genes that cause you to be a little bit less hungry, so you would be on the leaner side. What environment does is then it shifts that whole distribution, so that basically the mean shifts, so that everyone becomes, or most people become, heavier. And so sort of a phrase that people sometimes use is that genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. So basically, genetics sets your propensity, and then environment can basically unmask that. And so as we've had this change in environment where there's all of this, and we don't know exactly what the things are that have changed that are important, but there's all this ultra-processed food, highly palatable food, just various other things that you mentioned, seed oils, who knows if that's important. Certain people had these latent mutations that made them, say, very sensitive to palatable food. And in an earlier time, they may have been lean, but now because they have that latent capacity to be sensitive to ultra-processed food, they now gain tons of weight in the environment that we're in. It's still because of genetics, but it also requires the environmental component. I mean, you just take a step back, right? You can make anyone lean by just putting them, in prison and just only feeding them 1,500 calories. I mean, we've done those kinds of experiments. There's this famous experiment, the Minnesota starvation experiment, right? They basically, they put people in prison, but this is in World War II. They took a bunch of healthy volunteers, fed them 1,600 calories a day, and just asked what would happen if you basically semi-starved people. And unsurprisingly, they lose an incredible amount of weight. All they think about is food. They basically, their body temperature goes down, their heart rate goes down. They just become obsessed with food. And you could always do that for anyone, right? But in a given environment where you're not in that kind of situation, then your propensity to gain weight will be determined by genetics. So that's the idea.
I very much appreciate that description, and I know a great number of other people will as well, because the explanation for the increase in obesity has not been described with that level of accuracy and detail with respect to the interactions between genetics and the environment. Is it fair to say that what's changed in our environment is the free availability of food? You know, I was walking through an airport yesterday, and every 20 meters or so, there's a vending machine or a restaurant. The cost of calories is fairly low, right? Yeah. Getting high quality, nutritious food that tastes great is expensive, I would argue. But getting calories is fairly inexpensive.
Yeah. I think that's a plausible hypothesis. It's one of several plausible hypotheses, and it would be surprising to me if it didn't contribute. But the reality is these population level questions is just so hard to actually know, because you can't do an experiment, right? We can't create a parallel society where we manipulate one of these variables and see if the people become obese. So I think probably the availability of food, of the free availability, the low cost is one part of it. Another part of it is probably, although again, it's not proven, is that these ultra processed foods have a number of features that make people prone to gain weight. And there's really beautiful work, I don't know if you know about this, from Kevin Hall at the NIH, who's investigated this. So he's really, in my opinion, the best person doing this kind of human obesity research today. And he does these experiments where he takes people into the NIH, into the hospital, hospitalizes them for several weeks so he can exactly control what they eat. And he did this beautiful experiment where basically he had chefs prepare two kinds of food, one ultra-processed and the other not ultra-processed, sort of more whole foods, more healthier foods, but had them take a lot of care so that when they gave the foods to independent raters, to people to test, they would say, this is about equally palatable. So I like this ultra-processed dish as much as this non-ultra-processed dish.
What's an example of an ultra-processed dish? Like a out-of-package macaroni and cheese?
Exactly, that kind of stuff.
With bacon kind of thing?
Exactly.
Versus some pasta sitting next to a vegetable and a nice piece of salmon or something?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Took people into the hospital, basically allowed them to eat just as much as they would like, first of the ultra-processed meals. So they had the selection of ultra-processed meals for a couple weeks, and then switched them to the non-ultra-processed meals, and then also did it in the reverse order. So the other half of the people, they got the regular food first, and then they got the ultra-processed food. And what he found is that even though people rated the foods as equally palatable, they ate much more of the ultra-processed food, and they actually gained weight during that 2-week period when they were being given the ultra-processed foods. And then when you switch them, they lost weight. So the idea being that you can have two sets of food that you sort of have equal preferences for, but something about the ultra-processed food is making you eat more of it when you actually consume it. Mm-hmm. And there's a number of ideas about why that could be. So one idea is that these ultra-processed foods have been optimized to have the right percentage of fat and sugar and protein to sort of promote more consumption once you start eating it. So that could be part of it. Another idea is that, a big thing about whole foods is that they take more energy to digest and they have more volume. So one of the striking things from that study is if you just look at the pictures of the meals, they're the same number of calories, but there's so much more food seemingly on the non-processed food versus the ultra-processed food. And that's just because whole foods are bigger because they're not so energy dense. So, and we know that, for example, volume is a major signal in the short term for regulating food intake. So if you just eat more volume, that could be valuable. And so there's lots of things like that. So I think that's another plausible hypothesis, but the truth is we don't really know.
in dreams by the sea, echoes of a distant melody. In the nights, just you and me. Photographs and shades of gold, stories that we've never told, memories that never grow old. In this heart they're always bold. Time moves on, but we stay here. In the moments crystal clear, echoes of the yesteryear. In our hearts we hold them near. Fading memories in the light, lost in whispers of the night. In the silence we take flight, holding on to what feels right. Walks through streets of neon glow, silent whispers, tales of woe. In the dark our secrets show. In this art our love will grow. Time moves on, but we stay here. In the moments crystal clear, echoes of the yesteryear. In our hearts we hold them near. Fading memories in the light, lost in whispers of the night. In the silence we take flight, holding on to what feels right. In the twilight, shadows play, awful whispers, tales of woe. In the hearts we find our say, in the dawn we'll never stray. Fading memories in the light, lost in whispers of the night. In the silence we take flight, holding on to what feels right. As the days turn into years, through the laughter, through the tears. In the echoes all our steers. In these dreams we face our fears. As the days turn into years, through the laughter, through the tears. In the echoes all our steers. In these dreams we face our fears.
I have a hypothesis, and I don't want to force you into speculation, but given that you've studied and discovered that the neurons and circuits involved in appetitive and consummatory behaviors can learn based on experience and expectation, I think it's fair game to at least ask your thoughts on this. So I've been paying a lot of attention to the landscape of what the general public think about, let's call them elimination diets, where people will just eat meat.
Yes.
Or will go onto a vegan diet, or do some time-restricted feeding, or do any number of different things that have been shown to promote weight loss, provided people obey the laws of thermodynamics and consume fewer calories than they burn.
Yeah.
Right. I do believe in calories in, calories out, and there are a number of different routes to get there, and some are more painful, some are less painful, and it depends on the individual lifestyle, exercise, and on and on. But let's just suppose for a moment, based on Kevin's work on highly processed foods versus whole foods, that there's a learning that takes place when we eat.
Yes.
And that this learning takes place over time such that our brain and appetite start to link the variables of taste, macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, sort of knowledge about macronutrients. A piece of fish is mostly protein, has some fat. Mm-hmm. A bowl of rice is mostly carbohydrate, has some protein.
Yeah.
Put a pat of butter on it, has some fat also, right? It's sort of obvious. But taste, macronutrient content, calories, which we already know people with anorexia are exquisitely good at counting with their eyes. Mm-hmm. So it's possible they represent, a pathologic extreme of this. And micronutrient content, maybe even amino acid content, like how much leucine is there. Now, most people aren't thinking about how much leucine is in a meal, but we know that leucine is important for certain aspects of muscle metabolism. It's present in certain proteins and not others. You're going to find less of it in a vegetable typically than you would in a piece of chicken, and so on. And that when people eat mostly non-processed or minimally processed foods, and not in combination. So we're not talking about stewing all this together or blending all of it together, which sounds disgusting, right? Broccoli, rice, and a chicken breast blended together just sounds horrible. But eating them separately, if there's some olive oil and a little pat of butter involved, like that sounds pretty good. Mm-hmm. But a highly processed food in some ways is a blending together of macronutrients, micronutrients, if there are any, and other features of the food that neurons in the brain seem to pay attention to, and then giving it a unified taste, a Dorito, right?
Yes.
A candy bar that we attach to the product, we attach to the name of the processed food, to the packaging. But I could imagine, and here's the hypothesis, that is quote unquote confusing to our neural circuits in a way that doesn't match up well with our thermodynamic requirements of how much we're burning versus how much we need to eat. Whereas when I eat a piece of steak and a vegetable, I actually want less carbohydrate afterwards. If I eat the carbohydrate first, for me, it's difficult because I love the taste of carbohydrates, especially when they're combined with fat. But there seems to be an easier time regulating food intake when people step back and say, I'm going to consume minimally processed whole foods. And I'm guessing it's not just because they're trying to be healthier. That might be what stimulates the shift, but that the brain starts to learn the relationship between food volume, smell, taste, what these things look like, and satiation at the level of, oh, that's enough amino acids because I had a piece of fish. So maybe I don't need to consume as much of some other things. Or the vegetables provide volume and fiber, and often vegetables can taste really delicious too. So that there's a linking of nutrients, calories, and taste in a way that's more appropriately matched to the energetic demands of the organism, in this case, us, humans, that highly processed foods bypass.
Yeah.
Okay, now I realize that was long-winded, and forgive me, but my audience is used to that. Whenever I'm trying to table something for, no pun intended, for discussion that I would like to think can at least stimulate some additional thinking about a landscape, in this case, nutrition and feeding behavior, that for a lot of people is just really confusing. And here's why, and this is the last thing I'll say. I have several friends who have been very overweight their entire lives, for whom the following diet has worked exceptionally well. I'm not a diet coach. I'm not a nutritionist. I don't pretend to be one. I say eat proteins like meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, and fruit, and do that for a couple of months, and then add back in starches as you see fit based on your food intake. And without fail, they all lose a ton of weight. They're very happy with that. They add back in a minimum of starches. They keep the weight off, and they're also exercising, but not more than they were before in most cases. And I don't think that it's meat or fish or vegetables per se. I think it's that they finally develop an appreciation for what different foods have in terms of what they actually need. And without fail, they all say, oh, I went to this party and I had a piece of cake and it didn't taste good to me after 3 or 4 bites. So that's interesting too. So I just would like your thoughts on this. We're not defining any new diets. I don't sell any diets. I don't do any of that. But I find it amazing that when people start eating minimally processed whole foods, I have to assume that their brain changes as it relates to appetite, craving, and just kind of an unconscious understanding about what food is providing them or not, and that highly processed foods basically bypass all of this and just get you to consume more, perhaps in hopes of getting something that you probably aren't getting at all, or that you need to consume a lot of this food in order to get.
Yeah. There's several interesting ideas there. So there's 2 that come to mind just thinking about what you just said. So the one is the idea of what's going on when these people consume simpler diets, more of whole foods. And one thing I think that's very likely going on is this phenomenon of sensory-specific satiety is being engaged. Mm-hmm. And so sensory-specific satiety is just the idea that as you expose yourself repeatedly to a certain flavor or taste, you basically lose appetite for that. You get specific loss of appetite for that flavor or taste. This is why, as you said, basically if you start off eating the protein, after a while, I don't want any more salmon, but I would like some carbohydrates now, because you have this sensory specific satiety. And so it's well known, actually, that if you simplify your diet, make your diet really simple so there's just a few things, then sensory specific satiety alone can cause you to eat less, basically because there's just less variety in your diet and you don't want to eat more of that same thing. And so I think a lot of diets actually, it's not about the specific macronutrient or the specific food. It's just that they're reducing the variety in the diet. Eventually you just get sick of eating the same thing. And this is the thought behind that idea, is that it's important evolutionarily so that you eat a diverse diet. It's the reason probably that you want sweets after you've eaten a savory meal and so on. A second idea, though, that comes to mind is just, as you mentioned, this idea of learning. And so much about our preferences for food they're not innate, they're driven by learning, right? And so there are some things that are innate. So if you put sugar on a baby's tongue, it'll smile, indicating that it likes it. And if you put something bitter, it'll frown. And a rat will do the same thing, a neonate rat. But most of flavor and the perception of food is not just sweet or bitter. It's this much more complex sensation that involves smells, it involves tastes, and then it involves how those tastes and smells interact with the post-ingestive effects of the nutrients. So the sensing of those nutrients in your stomach and in your intestine, primarily in your intestine, are thought to then feed back and then change your preference for these foods. And so, there's lots of examples of this that you can just imagine from everyday experience. Most people, the first time they had a beer or the first time they had a glass of coffee, found it repulsive, right? Because it's extremely bitter. But then we come to crave these things because we know what they do to our body. We like what they do to our body. And that doesn't just make us take them like they're medicine. We actually somehow change our very perception of how that flavor is. We actually come to savor that flavor we previously found disgusting. And it's because our sensation of whether something's good or bad depends on our internal state. And so it's an interesting idea, perhaps if these ultra-processed foods that have so many different ingredients in such an unnatural combination, perhaps this process of learning about the nutrient content of different foods and flavors becomes impaired because it's just the brain's used to saying, this is a piece of chicken and this is primarily protein. And so I can gauge, from this flavor, I can connect this flavor to an amino acid content, but something that's so diverse, it might be harder to do.
And isn't it the case that the neurons in the gut and the hormones that are produced by the gut as we digest food, and that the neurons in the brain that control appetite and feeding have to be tuned to macronutrient content, because those are the primary colors of nutrients, and nutrients are the way in which we can persist on a day-to-day basis, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to sound more sophisticated where simpler terms would suffice. What I'm basically saying is that the neurons in our brains that control these behaviors, both eating and cessation of eating an ingredient or an entire meal, can't be tuned to a particular food product or to chicken or to an egg or to a steak or to lentils, but rather to amino acid content, essential amino acid content in particular, essential fatty acids. And in the case of carbohydrate, whatever is going to replace whatever glycogen we might have depleted, right? I mean, like if we really break it down into biology, eating is for a purpose. And my understanding is that the purpose of eating is to replace those things as needed, rather than to, taste savory or taste,
absolutely. Those are just those things, those sensory cues are just markers that tell the brain what might be in that substance. Mm-hmm. I think if you if you look at broadly at this difference between calories and macronutrients and micronutrients, I would say what you see is that most of the circuits that are controlling hunger are primarily calorie specific. So they can, like for example, an AGRP neuron, I can put sugar, fat, or protein into the stomach of a mouse and to an equal extent inhibit an AGRP neuron as long as they have equal calories.
Really?
Yeah.
So a little drop of olive oil into the belly that has of an animal that has let's say a little bit more. Let's say 120 calories of olive oil is equal potent to 120 calories of chicken breast?
At the level of these AGRP neurons, it is.
So they don't care about
they don't care about the
macronutrient.
No, they're really concerned
so I'm
about
probably wrong
they're
in my
really
earlier
concerned about
hypothesis.
energy. There are circuitries that are more concerned with macronutrients individually, although I don't think we know nearly as much about how that works. And I think the evidence is clear that the strongest offended macronutrient by far is protein. So protein, I don't think really sugar and fat intake are strongly defended in the sense that you're fine if you go without eating sugar, right? Basically, you can synthesize sugar from amino acids, for example, and you don't develop a specific sugar appetite in the same way you do, for example, if you deprive yourself of hunger and you develop a protein hunger or essential. I think the difference is that proteins consist of essential amino acids. There's just this, I forget if it's 9, I think, amino acids that your body cannot synthesize. You absolutely need them or you will die. And so, whereas sugar and fat can be interchanged with other macronutrients. So, and there's other things also that you absolutely need to ingest, like sodium chloride, right? So sodium. So if you deprive an animal of sodium, they will develop this salt appetite that's incredible, basically, and that's completely innate. But I think salt appetite and protein appetite are the things that are probably the most strongly regulated at the level of the macro and micronutrients.
I'd like to take a brief break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that has everything you need. That means the electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium in the correct amounts and ratios, and nothing you don't, which means no sugar. Now, I and others on this podcast have talked about the critical importance of hydration for proper brain and body functioning. Even a slight degree of dehydration can diminish cognitive and physical performance. It's also important that you get adequate electrolytes. The electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium, are critical for the functioning of all the cells in your body, especially your neurons, your nerve cells. Drinking Element dissolved in water makes it very easy to ensure that you're getting adequate hydration and adequate electrolytes. To make sure I'm getting proper amounts of hydration and electrolytes, I dissolve 1 packet of Element in about 16 to 32 ounces of water when I wake up in the morning, and I drink that basically first thing in the morning. I'll also drink Element dissolved in water during any kind of physical exercise I'm doing, especially on hot days when I'm sweating a lot, losing water and electrolytes. They have a bunch of different great tasting flavors of Element. My favorite is the watermelon, although I confess I also like the raspberry and the citrus. Basically, I like all the flavors. And Element has also just released a new line of canned sparkling Element. So these aren't the packets you dissolve in water. These are cans of Element that you crack open like any other canned drink, like a soda, but you're getting your hydration and your electrolytes with no sugar. If you'd like to try Element, you can go to drinkelement, spelled LMNT.com/Huberman to claim a free Element sample pack with the purchase of any Element drink mix. Again, that's drinkelement.com/Huberman to claim a free sample pack. If we could talk about body weight homeostasis for a moment, I think that would be useful. So let's say somebody decides they want to lose some weight, they caloric restrict slightly, either by exercising more or eating less or both. Their body weight drops by a bit. Let's say they lose 10 pounds, 8 of which are body fat. They lose a little bit of lean mass also. They're now at a new lower body weight. Are the AGRP neurons motivated to have them seek out more food? In other words, are they hungrier and more motivated to find and eat food? Or do these AGRP neurons learn, hey, body weight is lower and I don't need to push to find so much food so often?
No, I mean, the idea is that the AGRP neurons are more active when you lose weight, and that chronic activation of those neurons, in part because leptin levels are lower in the blood because you've lost weight, is that drive, that counter-regulatory drive that drives you to then consume more food.
But then how do people ever keep weight off?
Well, so part of the answer is they don't. I mean, so there's
Really? Because I would argue, like, I have these friends who were very heavy. Most of the excess weight was body fat for a long time. They seem to be doing great,
yeah,
eating the way that I described